The Chicago Bears traded for a new offensive lineman who could start week one if the injury situation doesn't improve up front. It was all part of an offensive line shakeup right before the 53-man roster deadline day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. On the show today, we check in on the Bears' 53-man roster moves done the day before the last day, starting with the big trade for Miami Dolphins offensive lineman Dan Feeney, as well as the release of Alex Leatherwood, which was a surprise to some and less of a surprise to others. We'll also talk about the decision made at backup quarterback with P.J. Walker being released early in this process, paving the way for Tyson Bagent to take over as the new number 2 quarterback. And we'll wrap up looking at a full Bears 53-man roster prediction and some of the biggest, or I guess most difficult decisions in front of Ryan Poles as he heads into the 3 o'clock deadline. I know this is kind of a tricky game to play here because roster moves are going to be coming fast and furious throughout the day as this podcast comes out, so perhaps things we end up talking about here become a little bit outdated, but bear with me here as we record this late Monday night after the Chicago Bears traded for Dan Feeney from the Miami Dolphins, trading what's been reported as a 6th-round pick to Miami for an offensive lineman who they signed this offseason in free agency to a 1-year deal to be potentially compete for a potential starting job there, or maybe be a top backup for them. Kind of was going to depend on how the rest of their offseason went there, but obviously they felt Feeney was expendable on that offensive line. And of course, the Bears have some significant injuries, with Tevin Jenkins going to miss some unknown amount of time. You've got Cody Whitehair, whose hand currently prevents him from snapping, but can still play guard. You got Lucas Patrick, who didn't play all preseason because of injury. Doug Kramer suffers an injury in the last preseason game. And Dan Feeney comes in as a guy who can play center. He can play guard. He played offensive tackle in college, but among other positions, but I think he's more limited to the interior O-line at this stage of his career. And I think he's been, over the course of his career, below average. This is not a bona fide stud coming in who's going to lock down this offensive line, but you gave him a 6th-round pick. This is not like you went out of your way to get some kind of game changer at the position. He started his career, I think, a 3rd-round pick with the Los Angeles Chargers, started a couple seasons at left guard for them, and then moved to the interior at center. Made the jump over to the New York Jets in free agency as kind of a backup, because with the Chargers, I think he was a little bit underwhelming at that point after his rookie contract, and I think the Chargers were looking to upgrade that spot. There's a reason he goes from 16-game starter to backup with his next team, and still now backup with the Chicago Bears. But fortunately, as far as getting acclimated in Chicago, he was in Miami playing in a Mike McDaniel's offense that is the same coaching tree that Luke Getsy comes from. Not the same verbiage, not the same, vocabulary, not exactly the same system purely top to bottom, but a lot of similar sort of relations there that should make it a little bit of an easier transition for Feeney. Before that, he played for the Jets with Mike LaFleur, brother of Matt LaFleur of the Green Bay Packers. Same offensive coaching tree, right? So there's some continuity here. And from a scheme standpoint, Feeney moves pretty well. He's got good feet. He just doesn't necessarily have great strength or power, particularly I think in the upper body. And guys can drive him back pretty well. He doesn't have super great arm length or super great hand strength. And so sometimes when a defender can get his hands inside on him first, it's game over. Like Feeney definitely has some very real weaknesses here. He is not a guy that you want to rely on as a potential, 16, 17 game starter type player. But if you have to plug him in here and there, you feel like he's got some experience and maybe a little bit more to fall back and rely on than a Doug Kramer, who might be hurt, or also a Dieter Iselin, for example, guys already, on the offseason depth chart here. I think the Bears wanted to get some more veteran experience. And to me, I equate Dan Feeney to basically like another Lucas Patrick type, where it's like he's not really good enough to start, but you appreciate his versatility and experience as a backup, as opposed to some of the other options that you had on your roster. He replaces, I think, Alex Leatherwood as far as putting together a 53-man roster prediction. And we'll get through to the kind of a full 53-man roster. But when you think about the team moving on from Alex Leatherwood and finally kind of giving up, saying, hey, we tried to develop him. We'll see what we could do, or we thought we could see what we could do, but ultimately didn't get better enough for us to justify keeping him on this roster. So, I was thinking the Bears would probably end up keeping 9 offensive linemen because of the injury. I wondered if Leatherwood would be one of them, but I didn't think they should, but I thought they might still be patient with Leatherwood. But I also kind of felt like that was a prime spot where they could claim someone on waivers and make that waiver claim, the 9th offensive lineman in the place of a guy like Alex Leatherwood or maybe Jatiri Carter, on the interior of that offensive line, knowing that you've got all these injuries at center, and it's kind of hard to figure out who and where and what they want to keep at that spot there. So I think that was kind of the big question for me. I mean, maybe there's still a chance somebody like Dieter Iselin or Doug Kramer could also make the roster just to give you more, center depth. I feel like Iselin has the versatility, but Kramer was the guy they were playing ahead of him in the preseason. We don't know for sure that a guy like Carter is perfectly safe. I think we're solid that Borum is safe as your swing tackle, and now Feeney is for sure one of your backup offensive linemen, and I guess Lucas Patrick is too, as considered a backup. We'll also see if Tevin Jenkins, obviously he's going to make the initial 53-man roster, but they could put him on IR after Tuesday, because if you put them on IR before the roster deadline, then they're automatically out for the season. But if you want to put them on short-term injured reserve, they have to be a part of your initial submitted 53-man roster and take someone else's roster space. Then after the 3 p.m. deadline, you could put Jenkins on IR, free up a roster spot, and add an additional backup offensive lineman. So it could be that way. If they think Jenkins is going to miss a good 4 games, that's another way this 53-man roster could ultimately shake up a little bit further on the offensive line beyond just the Leatherwood trade and the Feeney trade, the Leatherwood release, and maybe another waiver claim sometime down the line if indeed Tevin Jenkins goes on injured reserve. Bears didn't do many moves ahead of the deadline day in terms of like a handful of bottom of the roster guys cut, but really the only other big headline at this point was the decision at quarterback. I think that may have been the first decision the Bears made, the first decision that was reported, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but one of the first decisions they made was PJ Walker being released. We'll look at why that happened, what that means for the quarterback position next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Gametime makes it so easy to get tickets for your favorite events. It's fast, it's simple for all of the live sports, all of the live music, comedy shows, theater, anything near you. They've got it with killer deals on last-minute tickets and a best price guarantee. So you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you'll have. I like using it as an event discovery app. I can see who's going to be in town around me that maybe I didn't realize. Instead of going to each venue's website and seeing what they've got on the schedule, this has them all for me geographically and tells me where to go. And I know I'm getting not only great last-minute deals, but also that lowest price guarantee. So snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Tyson Bagent certainly did enough in the preseason to justify taking over the number 2 quarterback role. But I was still surprised that they went and released PJ Walker. I think PJ Walker offered some value as an experienced backup, and between his value there, plus the $2 million guaranteed that they had paid him on his 2-year, $4 million contract, plus the NFL's rule change this season for number 3 quarterbacks, I sort of assumed Bagent played his way into that 3rd quarterback spot, or maybe even that number 2 quarterback spot, but that you would keep 3 quarterbacks and your 2 backups would be Bagent and Walker. That Peterman would be screwed, but you'd keep Bagent and Walker, and both are allowed to be active on game day. That's the rule change this season, that, out of your 53-man roster, you can have 45 guys active on game day. You have to release your 8 inactives before the game. Your number 3 quarterback doesn't have to count towards that 45, and they can still be active on game day. They get to be a 46th active player. And so I would have thought the Bears keep both Walker and Bagent, keep developing Bagent, and if you have heaven forbid, I'm not even going to say the words, but if you have a need to get a backup quarterback in there, I'm not going to use you say the exact scenario there just to not put it out in the world. But if heaven forbid you have to put your backup quarterback in the game for some sort of reason, then you have the choice. Okay, is this a situation where we want the veteran who's started games before, who's been in this before, and can kind of come in and maybe right the ship here if things are getting a little rocky? Or is this a situation where we want to put in the undrafted rookie free agent and see if he can create some magic here and win us this football game? Like, I think certain situations in certain games might call for different things depending on the score and the opponent and the time of season and the time of the game, how much game is left, and so much more. Like, certain situations might call for a Walker versus a Bagent. And so I thought, why not keep both? And I'm still not super sure why not keep both. My theory here is that they kind of looked at this and said, listen, Tyson Bagent played like the better quarterback in the preseason. We feel satisfied enough with what he's shown us that he can be the number 2 quarterback, and we're not going to be super worried about that. So therefore, PJ Walker, being a veteran who's started games, and I think most, a lot of quarterbacks in his position would like to eventually maybe get back to being a starter someday and want to be in a situation where they're as close as they can be to taking the field and getting a chance to show other teams or your own team what you can do, so that they might trust you in a future quarterback competition, or maybe even bring you in with an opportunity to start and play more and earn more money. Like, of course, like every player at every position wants to get into a bigger and bigger role, in large part to make more and more money. And I just wonder if the Bears maybe looked at this and said, listen, we could keep PJ Walker as our number 3 quarterback on the depth chart, but then he's never going to have an opportunity to play. And I don't think PJ Walker would necessarily want to sit around all season as the number 3 quarterback and not get an opportunity to play. So do the Bears kind of do a veteran player a favor and say, listen, we signed you, we liked you, we're sorry it didn't work out. We want to let you still have the opportunity to go to another team and be the number 2 quarterback there, so that you are one play, one injury away from potentially taking over and getting back on the field. Because I feel like there are plenty of teams around the league that don't have very qualified backup quarterbacks right now. I mean, the one that stands out to me in particular is Green Bay. I certainly wouldn't want to see Walker go there, but I mean, they've got 5th round pick Sean Clifford is probably going to be their backup quarterback. Not a guy that they have a lot of faith in. And the Arizona Cardinals right now are literally tanking at quarterback, and they're going to start either rookie 5th round pick Clayton Tune in week 1, or perhaps like a Joshua Dobbs, who they traded for from the Cleveland Browns like earlier this summer. I mean, there are teams that have a need at backup quarterback that PJ Walker could go to one of those teams, not start right away, certainly, but just be their top backup, so that he may have that chance to get into a game and show a little bit more of what he can do, as opposed to holding the clipboard literally all season long as potentially the number 3 quarterback for the Chicago Bears. To me, there's still value in rostering PJ Walker, and I would have kept him as a number 3 quarterback, even, unless he just would have sort of refused or asked for his release in that regard, then like, okay, then we can have that conversation. But if Walker would have been willing to, and maybe he was, we don't know, I'm speculating, but if Walker is willing to be the number 3 quarterback behind Bagent, certainly would like him there to help mentor Bagent and honestly help mentor Justin Fields. I mean, he's not that much older than Fields, but enough, right? I mean, he's been in other systems, seen other things, been around the XFL and the NFL with a few different organizations. Like, I feel like there's some value there to having that voice in the quarterback room, and I'm a little surprised since they were already paying him $2 million guaranteed anyway. Why not hold on to PJ Walker in that conversation? Even if Bagent is your number 2 guy, your for sure top backup option, it just feels like there's some real value there. I would be most disappointed if for some reason they keep Nathan Peterman still as a number 3 quarterback, because I mean they did for most of last season. Peterman was around quite a bit, so they've shown a propensity to do so. But I don't understand why you would cut PJ Walker and keep Nathan Peterman over him as the number 3 quarterback. Because I would like to think we can all universally agree that PJ Walker over the course of his career has proven to be a better quarterback than Nathan Peterman, even if Walker didn't play that great in the preseason, for sure. But like, I trust PJ Walker in a game a lot more than I do Nathan Peterman at this point. So it really wouldn't make sense to me if they kept 3 quarterbacks still and not one of them was Walker, unless Walker didn't want to be a number 3 quarterback and like would have essentially requested his release had the Bears tried to keep him as a number 3 quarterback. Like maybe they came to him and said, listen, Bagent's our 2. Do you want to stick as the number 3, or would you rather we release you and let you go? And maybe he says, yeah, I'd rather take my chances of trying to get to another team, knowing that he's got that $2 million already in the pocket from the guaranteed money that the Bears paid him when they signed him to that contract. So that's my theory on the quarterbacks here. Congratulations to Tyson Bagent. I think it's ultimately the right move to trust the young quarterback and try and develop him maybe he becomes a really solid backup and nothing more. And that would still be great for an undrafted rookie free agent, or maybe he becomes something even better down the line. I think it's definitely worth exploring that path, and it's going to be exciting to see what Bagent's able to do over the next few seasons, or at least hopefully it's the next few preseasons, and we never have to see Tyson Bagent take the field on offense in a regular season game, because Justin Fields is out there for all 17 games, every single snap, and lighting up the field, across the board. So those were kind of the big moves to start the 53-man roster cut down. There were others, undrafted free agent offensive linemen like Robert Haskins, I think, was released, or, some of the wide receivers and the, Darius Fountain, cornerback Michael Ojemudia, defensive tackle Andrew Brown, some of these other guys that never really had much of a shot to make the 53-man roster anyway. We got some of those initial moves. Still a lot more cut downs for the Bears to do throughout the day today as the podcast comes out. So we'll go through some of the more difficult decisions ahead and use that as a way to look at a full 53-man roster prediction next on Locked On Bears. Oops. Injuries certainly make it complicated to try and predict how the Chicago Bears are going to shape their final 53-man roster. But I think for the most part, this comes down to a handful of decisions at a couple of different positions. And I think a few other spots are a little bit more, I don't want to say cemented because anything can change with waiver wire claims, but I think there's a few spots that are a little bit more predictable at this stage of the process. So like if we start on offense, right? I think we kind of know right now 2 quarterbacks. Be weird if they kept 3 with Peterman, but never say never, I guess. But for the most part, 2 quarterbacks, Fields and Bagent at this point. Running back becomes a little challenging for me because I don't know if they keep Travis Homer as the number 4 running back or just go with 3 there. Like he's the first kind of tough decision point that I find myself at. It's Herbert, it's Foreman, it's Roschon Johnson, if you ask me. And then Homer makes it as the number 4 running back. I think the speculation of Foreman being released, I would be surprised if they do. Again, never say never, but I would be surprised if Dante Foreman got released. I think they have bigger plans for him than we saw in the preseason so far. So Homer is one that's dangling here that I think you could release him and keep an extra player at a different position, or maybe cut another player at another position and keep Homer as that 4th running back. But his special teams experience certainly makes him valuable there. Kari Blasingame, fullback, making the team. 3 tight ends, Cole Kmet, Robert Tonyan, Mercedes Lewis. Maybe they claim a 4th on waivers, but I'd be really surprised if any of the other tight ends they had on the roster make this 53. Wide receiver, mostly cut and dry more Mooney Claypool, Equanimeous St. Brown, Tyler Scott. Velus Jones, wide receiver 6. That's where you start to have a question mark. Do they give up on Velus Jones after one season or not? We talked about that a little bit on yesterday's podcast. I believe that was yesterday or the day before. I still think they're going to be more patient with Velus Jones, but we'll see. They weren't patient with Alex Leatherwood, but they didn't use a third-round pick to acquire Alex Leatherwood. So I think Velus Jones sticks as the number 6 wide receiver, but that one maybe could have some flexibility. Offensive line, tough to predict. We know our starting 5 when they're healthy, plus Larry Borum, plus Dan Feeney, plus Lucas Patrick. I think those 8 are locked in, and then it's a question is, do they keep 9 with Jatiri Carter, or do they claim another guy on waivers afterward? Do they put Tevin Jenkins on injured reserve and then bring another offensive line back? Like maybe Carter misses the initial 53, but then Jenkins goes on IR and they bring Carter right back after clearing waivers. That one's a little bit tough to predict because of the injuries, but mostly on offense here, right? The only question marks are Homer, Velus Jones, and then maybe the offensive line. But for the most part, the rest of that 53-man group seems more or less, I don't want to, again, not set in stone. Trying to predict exactly what Ryan Poles is going to do is very, very difficult, and inevitably something will be wrong and something unexpected will change on there. But for the most part, I think we got a decent grasp of where that might go. Defensively, I think another one of these inflection points is at defensive end. Do they keep 5? We know Travis Gibson requested a trade. I'm guessing they're either going to cut or trade him then. So then it's Ngakoue, Walker, Robinson, Green. Does Terrell Lewis stick as the 5th defensive end? Or do they want to cut him there and then use another roster spot at a different position, right? Keep another safety, keep another tight end, keep another running back, keep another offensive lineman. It's hard to say at this point. I think the fact that Lewis got in with the starters against the Bills was a really good sign for him. And I think, too, when you look at like the defensive line makeup right now, like I've got 4 defensive tackles, Jones, Billings, Dexter, Pickens. I think DeMarcus Walker is going to end up playing more defensive tackle than I think we're accounting for. And they might view him as sort of like half defensive tackle, half defensive end. So you keep 4 other defensive ends and 4 other defensive tackles until you got 4.5 at each of those 2 spots. Linebacker's tricky too. We talked about that with the injuries earlier this week on the podcast. It depends on how injured Dylan Cole and Noah Sewell are. I think Michael Walker at this point is going to make the roster, but that's a spot that's primed for a waiver wire claim. I think it's 6 linebackers: Edwards, Edmonds, Sanborn, Walker, Cole, Sewell. But that's assuming a certain amount of health from Cole and Sewell. And I could see them saying, okay, like Cole or Sewell is not injured enough to go on IR, but injured enough that they're not available right now. So they keep a 7th linebacker just due to injury. And maybe you cut Terrell Lewis then. Or maybe you cut a Travis Homer then. You find where you can trim the fat somewhere else to keep extra players due to injury. Cornerback, I think you got 5 guys locked in. Jalen Johnson, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon as your 2 outside in your slot. And then Jalen Jones and Terrell Smith, I think, are pretty locked in as your number 4 and number 5 cornerbacks as your backups on the outside. It really comes down to that slot cornerback position, the backup slot spot. Josh Blackwell hurt all preseason. We talked about that on yesterday's podcast. Greg Stroman's been there. He's been the top backup throughout this process. That's another spot where I could see them making a waiver claim, or maybe initially keeping Josh Blackwell on the 53-man roster, then getting past the deadline and putting him on injured reserve, and then bringing Greg Stroman back to be the temporary replacement until Josh Blackwell gets off of injured reserve. That one's the other spot that I think is really hard to predict. But I think safety's pretty locked in. Eddie Jackson, Jaquan Brisker, Elijah Hicks, AJ Thomas. Those are your 4 there. So really, like defense, it's Terrell Lewis. Does he make it? Does he not? It's linebacker. Do they keep another 7th guy there because of injury? And it's backup slot cornerback, Stroman versus Blackwell versus somebody on the outside. So it's like 3 guys on defense, plus what we talked about on offense. Maybe it's Travis Homer, Velus Jones, and Jatiri Carter, 9th offensive lineman. I count then like basically 6 spots, 6 roster spots that are kind of a question mark at this point. And then it feels like the other 47 are pretty much good to go. Of course, special teams, not to totally ignore them. Santos, Trenton Gill, Lucas Patrick, that's the last 3 to get us to 53. But like, to me, it's those 6 spots feel like inflection points right now. And the other 47 feel a little bit more of a sure thing. Again, not very many players are a true lock, especially not outside of the starting lineup. So you never know. Maybe a Foreman could be a surprise cut, or maybe one of the linebackers is a surprise cut, or one of the defensive ends is a surprise cut, or something like that. There's always room for surprises, but we feel pretty good, I think, about 47-ish of those guys, and then it's 6 here or there. Do you want to keep Travis Homer for his special teams ability, or would you rather keep Terrell Lewis for his depth? You need another linebacker. Like it ends up being guys competing against other players not at their own position for limited roster spot. It's not, is Homer better than the other running backs? Is Homer more valuable than another linebacker or another corner or another defensive end, where it's a little bit harder to judge and certainly impossible for us to know exactly how the Chicago Bears will view that decision between those two players. However they decide, you can be sure we're going to break down that initial 53-man roster plus all the waiver claims tomorrow and throughout the rest of the week here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Really appreciate everyone who makes Locked On Bears their first listen, our everydayers tuning in 5 days a week. If you want even more Bears content, you can join the Locked On Bears subtext group at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBears for extra breakdowns, all 22 film, data, charting, and so many more goodies there, plus a direct line to text me. It's $4.99 a month. Join subtext.com/LockedOnBears. No matter what, though, you got to come on back, listen to the podcast again tomorrow, and make sure that you get another opportunity to bear down.